Elizabeth Warren has dropped out of the race, suspending her campaign earlier today. Her final rally turned out to be right here in Detroit's Eastern Market on Super Tuesday. Also, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer has endorsed former Vice President Joe Biden in the race. She joins other party people like former Senator Carl Levin and former Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. In Michigan, Senator Bernie Sanders is endorsed by U.S. House Representative Rashida Tlaib and former gubernatorial candidate and now CNN contributor Abdul El-Sayed. So on to Sven's conversation.
All right, Dave, former Vice President Joe Biden scored a bunch of, huge wins yesterday, including big states like Texas, North Carolina, Virginia. Bernie Sanders, of course, notched a big win in California. He also picked up Colorado. Biden is now ahead of Sanders in the delegate count. We've seen a whole bunch of candidates in the past week drop out, most recently Michael Bloomberg. What does this all mean for the race, and why or how has Biden seemingly made such a dramatic turnaround?
Lots of great questions there, Sven. I think it's a couple of things. Let's be careful about delegate count. California is still counting, right? That's point number one. And we've only got 88% of the vote counted as we talk here today. So more delegates are going to get churned out. I would expect Sanders to pick up more of those than Biden.
Good point.
That will narrow that delegate lead that the former vice president has. But his comeback is nothing less than astounding. And he was pretty much left for dead.
Yes.
After the Iowa caucuses and after another disappointing finish in New Hampshire. I think what happened was two things most important. One, two of the other candidates from that more moderate wing of the party, Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, they get out, and I think we see all of a sudden almost all of their support go right to Joe Biden. And I think if we look at results from Texas, we can see this pretty clearly from polls that were done 2 days before. Had Sanders at 30, Biden at 26, Bloomberg at 13, Warren at 12, and Buttigieg and Klobuchar each with 6. Well, if we look at the final results, Biden ends up with 34, Sanders at 30, and Buttigieg and Klobuchar still get a few votes, but we do some math, and Biden goes from 26 to 34. All of that can be seen coming right out of that Buttigieg and Klobuchar support base. So I think we see that happen. We see the Buttigieg and Klobuchar support on Super Tuesday go to Biden and pretty much nobody else, at least in those big places like Texas. I would imagine that Virginia was kind of the same way. I also think that across the country, Democrats got pragmatic and started to think more about beating Donald Trump. Well, I would take you back to 2004 when Howard Dean was the darling of the Democratic Party for an entire year in 2003,
right,
and was expected to blow away everybody in the Iowa caucuses. He was ahead in money. He was ahead in organization. He was ahead in the polls. Everybody in those three categories. And then all of a sudden in late December in 2003, Democrats kind of wake up and go, can we really nominate Howard Dean? Can he beat George W. Bush? So what do? They turn to John Kerry. And another candidate that was left for dead in late 2003, he had to take out another mortgage on his home in Boston for $6 million so he could pay his staff. Of course, he sees an immediate rise in the polls right before the Iowa caucuses and goes on to win. It was the Democratic Party getting pragmatic and saying, we need to win the general election.
Yeah.
And we need to find a candidate that gives us our best chance. And I wonder if that's not what's happening across the country with Democrats right now.
Yeah. What have the primaries so far, the ones that have been conducted, shown us about which, constituencies in terms of age groups and racial demographics and so forth are breaking for either candidate? Like which constituencies are strong for Biden and which for Sanders, in other words?
We are in a very murky Democratic primary. Things are constantly shifting. Things are unclear to a great degree. But what we do know is Joe Biden does really well with African American voters.
Right.
He really saw their support come home in South Carolina, at least in part because of Congressman Jim Clyburn's endorsement just a couple of days prior to that contest. But I think that he still, even without that, he would have gotten a large share of the African American vote. But that Clyburn endorsement really drove it home for Biden. And Bernie Sanders is very, very popular with college students, young voters, maybe 18 to 24. And in some of the contests where he has done well, he's seen a surge in turnout from those folks.
But in other primaries, I've been reading the young vote has not really turned out for him.
And that's the issue. He is popular with them, but that doesn't do him any good unless they get to the polls. And that holds for anybody, right? Winning elections is not a terribly complicated formula. It's identifying your supporters and getting them to the polls. You can have all kinds of support that's latent out there, that's hidden, but that doesn't do anything for you. You got to get them out to the polls.
So Michigan's primary obviously is next Tuesday, March 10th. There'll be 5 other states holding primaries on that same day. Michigan's obviously the biggest of any of those states. How important does the primary in Michigan become in the wake of Super Tuesday now? And do the results from Super Tuesday do anything, do you think, to change voters' minds one way or the other here?
Well, I think Michigan now becomes the next big thing, right? Michigan is the most delegate-rich state on the docket for next Tuesday. As you mentioned, the largest state, and with that comes the most delegates, 125. And given where we'll likely be in the delegate count, candidates are going to be after as many as they can get. So I think we're going to see Michigan take on more importance than some of the other smaller states that are going to go on March 10th. And I think that you'll see candidates prioritize it. Candidates will continue to be on the air here. They will continue to visit Michigan and really make it a priority.
There was a new poll by Detroit News and WDIV.
Right.
It found Biden leading Sanders by about 7 points among likely Democratic primary voters in Michigan. But of course, Bernie Sanders upset Hillary Clinton here famously back in 2016. What do you think the key factors are going to be here for the Michigan primary next week? What are the key issues behind that vote?
Well, I'll give you 3 of them. Turnout. I think it is. Joe Biden is going to focus on Wayne County, I would imagine, and try to drive African Americans to the polls. Bernie Sanders is going to be trying to drive young people as well as some working class blue collar voters that have an affinity for him. When he won here in 2016 in that primary, he was here talking about trade. He was here talking about NAFTA and TPP and how the U.S. had been saddled with bad trade deals. I don't think you'll hear him talk much about that in the next week or so here in Michigan, only because that would give Donald Trump an opening to say, yeah, Bernie, I agree with you, and I did something about it. But I still think in places like Macomb County, Bernie Sanders could do pretty well in a Democratic primary. And I think that what we're seeing is in that Detroit News poll, a shift. And a week or maybe 10 days ago, there was a poll in the Free Press that came out that had Sanders up by 8, 9, 10 points over Biden and Bloomberg.
Right.
And I think that we're seeing the shift between those 2 polls is not something that's wrong with either one of those polls or a poor execution of either of those polls. I think it reflects the shifting in the dynamics of the race, with Biden coming back, gaining momentum and gaining strength.
Yeah. So with this increasingly becoming kind of a 2-person race, right? Biden versus Sanders.
Yep.
There's a lot of concern out there that the Democratic Party is going to do something, make some kind of maneuvers to hurt Bernie Sanders and strengthen Biden. I mean, just today we're seeing that there are these new trending hashtags on Twitter, rigged primary and rigged DNC. I mean, how big are the risks that there's going to be this big splinter among left-leaning voters?
I think it's a risk. I think that it's there. And the Democratic Party establishment would be wise to try to mend some fences if possible. And that's not to say that I think that the Democratic Party is actively trying to stick it to Bernie Sanders. I think that, if anything, they've shown a willingness to be responsive to some of his complaints. He and his team worked with the Democratic Party after 2016 to get some revisions made to the convention process and the delegate process, where in 2020, superdelegates can't vote on the first ballot. Right, that stems directly from a Sanders complaint from 2016. So he got a rule change that he was looking for. That is important, because the way it's looking now, even with Biden in the lead, it appears that neither candidate is going to get to the convention with the requisite number of votes needed to win. Now, having said that, superdelegates can certainly come in on the second ballot and vote, and that could end it pretty quickly. And we would be, frankly, right back where we were in 2016, with Bernie Sanders saying the superdelegates stole it from me. We should have another type of process. But, frankly, the rules are the rules, and that's how that's how it might go down. But I do, to your point, I think that Sanders supporters would be pretty upset.
So, Dave Dooley, how do you see the primary going down next week? You care to make a prognostication?
Well, I think the poll that we talked about from the Detroit News is as good of an indicator as we've got right now. I would expect probably a tight race between Biden and Sanders, given that it's down to, those two. You've still got in that poll, you've got Bloomberg registering at 11. His exit and then endorsement of Biden probably means a lot of that vote will go to Biden. And we still see Buttigieg and Klobuchar register a little bit of support in the Detroit News poll, and that'll probably go to Biden. So it's really going to be, what can Sanders do to mitigate those gains that Biden's going to see from his support from other candidates?
Right. And finally, the question everybody wants to know, among the Democratic side at least, is which of these candidates can beat Trump? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think they can both beat him, but I also think that it's pretty naive to think that Donald Trump wouldn't rather face Bernie Sanders. And I say that because Donald Trump can beat the socialism drum again and again and again and again, especially in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where I don't think that's terribly popular. I was looking at some Gallup polling data from January, and they had listed a series of candidate characteristics and asked Americans about their willingness to vote for a party's well-qualified candidate who had some of these characteristics. And they went through a bunch of them: African-American candidate, Catholic candidate, Hispanic, Jewish American, female, evangelical. And all of them got over 70% of the American public to say, yeah, I would vote for one of those well-qualified candidates. The last one they asked about was a socialist candidate. And only 45% of Americans said that they would be willing to vote for a well-qualified socialist candidate. So I think that is a tough label to have to campaign on. And it's one that Sanders uses, as you know, very willingly. Now, he says Democratic socialist, but guess what the Trump campaign would do? They would just lump off that first term, and it would just be socialist. And this gets back to what I was saying before about how maybe the Democratic primary electorate is becoming pragmatic, where they're looking ahead and saying, okay, what's really our best shot?
All right, thanks for listening to Your Daily Detroit. And thanks to Laura, Dave, Sven, and Cheyenne for helping make this episode happen. Lots of big news, lots of moving parts. Thank you so much. Be sure to tell a friend about the Daily Detroit podcast. It's really the best way to push Detroit's conversation forward, and we can do that together. Tomorrow, the plan is that we'll shift gears into the fun lane for Friday. Man About Town Devin O'Reilly is in to chat about openings, closing, and events to check out around the city this month. With that, I'm Jairus Days. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.